Hi, today we're going to talk a little bit about binding and different methods of binding and how to get the best results. So, the first tip that I have is when you figure out how much binding that you need, go ahead and attach all of your binding together so it's one long continuous piece. And a tip I have for attaching binding strips together, regardless of what width you decide to use, is take the right sides together and put them at a 90-degree angle. And if you have salvage edges, you can leave that hang off the end a little bit. And I used to have trouble remembering which way I needed to run this through the machine. And sometimes it's helpful if you draw a diagonal line, because you want to, the easiest, nicest, cleanest way to attach binding is not to butt the ends up against each other like this, because then when you turn it out, you'll end up with a big seam here, and that's going to cause bulk in your binding on your quilt. So if you attach it at an angle, then you will spread that bulk over the entire length of the seam, and it will be far less bulky. And I struggled with how I needed to attach it. So now what I try to remember is that if I take my two short edges and put them on the right side of the machine and keep both long ends to the left, which is a little bit more natural when you're sewing anyways, to keep the bulk to the outside where it's not in your way, and keep them the smallest amount possible to the inside. And again, either draw a line, or if you can eyeball it, whichever. And it doesn't matter. I've got my walking foot on right now, and that'll work just fine. But you can use whatever foot you want. And just stitch a straight line all the way across. And if I had more pieces, I could still take, because they're a lot longer than this if they're width of fabric, and then just keep pushing them through so that they're all strung together. And then when I get the last one, take that off and cut them all apart. And if you feel better, double check to make sure you've got it right. And then trim the excess. And I try to trim somewhere around 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit more. Just something that'll stay out of the way. And then I'm going to snip this corner. And then when I press that open, I will have a nice continuous piece, and you'll be able to see that because the seam spreads from here to here, it reduces your bulk. And then however you want to finish your binding after that is up to you. So there's several different ways to do binding. I've got a few examples here. The first one, this one uses probably the least amount of fabric. You take a strip that's about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches wide. I would tend to do 1.5 inches wide because I know that I get a little bit generous with my 1/4 inches. They end up being a little more than 1/4 inch. So what you do is you take the strip, fold over 1/4 inch approximately, and then this is the side that will be attached to the quilt. And we'll get back to that. Another one is just like a bias fold, double fold, like the bias fold that you buy prepackaged. And this is, I just folded this in half, pressed it, and then opened it up and took each end and folded it close to the middle. You don't want to quite go all the way to the middle because you need a little bit of space to fold it over. And I'll show you how this works too. And one of the probably the most popular ways is to take a strip, frequently a 2.5-inch strip, just fold it in half and press it. And this works really great with all the 2.5-inch pre-cut strips, because you can just take those, fold them in half, and go with it. The other thing, there are lots of helpful utensils out there that will help you if you want to do the bias fold or the double fold. A lot of, I think it used to be more tradition that you would cut your strips on a bias so they were diagonal with the grain of the fabric, and then you would get a lot better stretch. Your prepackaged ones will be that way. It uses up a lot more fabric yardage though, so I think a lot of people now use just the width of fabric and cut their strips if they're just doing straight lines, squares, rectangles. You really only have to have bias binding, or it works better if you're doing a lot of curves. But if you're doing curves, you definitely want to cut your strips on the bias. So this is one tool. It's a strip maker, and the easiest thing to do is to pin the ends down once you get it started. And then as you pull this down, you just iron along there. And then I would just have to go back, fold it in half, or roughly in half, and press it again. Okay, so that's a few ways to make your binding. Set that aside. Get it out of the way here. So when you attach binding, you can start either with the front or the back of the quilt. You kind of have to know which way you're going to go, how you're going to finish it all the way, in order to decide. This kind, where you just turned it over and made kind of a J out of it, you would want to attach to the front generally. And most of the time you're going to use about a 1/4-inch seam allowance. If you're using 2.5-inch strips, it all depends. You have to play with it a little bit and figure out for sure what's going to work for you with what you use. But regardless, the best way to do it is to leave a little bit on the end before you get started. And then whether you want to back stitch a little bit or just go, it's not going to make that much difference because you won't pull that many stitches out. And I'm just going to go down to the end here and give you just an idea of how this works. So when I got all the way around, well, I'll show you on one of these other ones, but okay. And then I take this, wrap it around to the back, and then I can either stitch right next to this binding or right along the edge and catch the back side. And I probably could have done a little bit bigger seam allowance. And I do recommend using a walking foot anytime you're traveling across the quilt, all the layers, because it will help feed the layers more evenly and you'll get a better result. So here's what the back looks like. Another common way to finish it off is to hand stitch this down. Some people like hand stitching, some people don't like hand stitching at all. I don't really like doing it, so I try to finish everything that I have with just my machine. The double fold binding is very similar, but the easier thing about that is that you can put the whole thing on and just stitch through one time, since the binding is the same width on both sides. So what I can do, and this is where either clips work really well, or you could use pins. I could just pin this real quick in a couple of spots. And you can open this up and sew down one end and then wrap it around. But it does get a little bit difficult to get the both edges caught when you go back and top stitch over it. So really I would probably just do it this way. And then you get a really nice nice edge on both sides, as long as you catch the binding on both the top and the bottom. But it reduces it, it can reduce it down to one step, I guess, is what you could say. Another method, regardless of what kind of binding you use, works really well, and that would be to attach the binding to the back side of your quilt and turn it around to the front. So I'm going to show you that on this one. I'm also going to show you how to turn corners. So attaching the binding to the quilt the first time isn't so bad. It's more when you have to finish putting it together that you really need pins or clips or whatever. The fabric clips work really good. Pins work good. Whatever it works best for you. Just like a lot of quilting, it's personal preference and whatever works. Okay, so I've come to the corner and I stopped, if this is my 1/4 inch, I stopped a 1/4 inch from the edge. And I just eyeballed it. It'll be pretty close. And then I want to go backwards till I get off the edge. Now I can either leave my needle down, lift my presser foot and pull it out a little bit because the thread will be loose enough, or it doesn't make any difference. If I leave my needle up, I can completely cut these threads if I don't feel comfortable doing it this close to the machine, because it can be a little bit more challenging to work with. Excuse me. So what I do now is I'm going to fold my binding at a 45-degree angle. And again, there's lots of gadgets and gizmos out there, and if they help you, great. If you don't feel like you need them, that's fine too. But really what I'm doing is I want to make a straight line from the edge of my quilt through the whole binding strip. Then I come back and I fold down at a 90-degree angle from the first corner, from the first edge, So now I'm matching up my binding with my edge again. And underneath here, I've got a little triangle at a 45-degree angle. And this is going to give me a nice miter. And then I put it back under the machine, get the needle lined up, and I'm going to do my same seam allowance that I did the first side. So the reason that I didn't go all the way to the end is because I need that seam allowance width to be free. I'm going to show you again on this corner up here. I'm going to get close, but not quite. Pivot with my needle down, back off my fabric, the whole quilt, and once it's free, this gives me the space to do that 45-degree angle and fold it back down. So my fold is going to be even with this side, with that edge. And when I fold it back down towards me, this edge is going to be even with the edge of the quilt. And what should happen is my little triangle underneath is going to be completely hidden by this edge of the binding. And once you get this mastered, it's not near as difficult to do it right under the edge of your machine. Just pulling it back a little bit. And it's okay if I don't quite get all the way to the edge. I'm going to go one more stitch. I have a tendency to undershoot. Backing off the quilt again. And I'm just going to leave my needle down. And this time I'm just going to do it right here on the bed of my machine. Folding up at the angle, kind of finger pressing it to help it stay. And then lining that back up with the top edge. And folding it back down. And then just take off and go again. Looks like this might be long enough to go all the way around. Although I am going to find a little bit of difficulty when I get this corner turned to show you finishing here. Okay, so again, fold up, finger press that down, my edges are straight, and then coming back, lining up this edge, and lining up this edge, and then just continuing down. Okay, now that's about as far as I can go. Without getting in my way to show you finishing here. So there's a few different ways to finish as well. I can either take this, fold a little bit down. I could even fold it at a bit of an angle and then just tuck one end in the other end. And that gives me a nice finish. Now, the only downside is that I've got the bulk again. I also may need to hand stitch that because if I wash it, it may roll up a little bit. The other way to do it, and I'm not going to be able to show you because this is too short, but would be to take my ends of my quilt binding and stitch them together like this. And essentially, let me see if I can find. Oh, it's not really going to work either. What I have to do is fold the ends so that I have enough room. So I kind of squish these together, have enough room to go ahead and put my corners together, stitch across the angle, and then have this nice edge. And if this was my binding, then hopefully it would just lay flat. It's a little bit tricky to get everything right so that it lays flat, but the results are worth it. You get a really nice finish that way. So this one I don't have enough. I can play a little bit with trying to fold it into a little bit of a triangle and finishing. I could trim this up a little bit. Whatever you can make work. I've also decided recently that sometimes finished is better than perfect. So I'm just going to finger press this down. Stick that underneath. And we're going to make that work. So then I would go back. Finish that stitching. And be done. Now, what I'm going to do here is fold this binding over, and then I'm going to either pin or clip or whatever works. I'm going to pin today. Make sure I get this going the right direction. And then when I come to one of my corners, what I can do, see how this corner is on the bottom and this edge is on the top. I'm going to do the same thing on the underside. And I could trim that string, or I can just tuck it in and be done with it. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and pin there to hold that out of my way. And then I'm going to try push this all the way up to the edge, and then bring the top down at that angle. And that sneaky thread does not want to stay tucked in. And then I'm going to very carefully pin this little corner. Okay, and then I'm going to show you again on this corner. I usually do some of the edge first and then go back to the corners. It just seems easier for me. Maybe you want to do your corners first and then work along your edges. If you can get it to work, then that's the right way to do it for you. So again, here this side is underneath and this side is on the top. I'm going to go ahead and do it that way on this side. So holding that up to the edge and then folding down. And then pinning that so that it stays in place for me. And then I'm just working everything to get it laying flat and looking nice for me. I needed one pin. And I have a tendency to get my binding so tight that the only thing that'll hold it well is pins. And again, this is going to be the back side that I stitched everything to first, and then I'm rolling it around to the front. Now what this enables me to do, go down a little further here, is to use my machine to stitch down my binding, and I will be able to see whether or not I'm catching this edge. Because if I can just stitch from the top, I have a whole lot more control of what's happening to the edge of my binding. So I'm just going to take my time, stitch along that edge, pull my pins out before I get to them, and if I need to hold and press a little bit, I can still do that. And you'll see my binding is having a little bit of a tendency to push itself up in the middle of my presser foot. So I just lift it, put it back down again to get it laying flat and underneath the foot better. Really? Thank you. And then I'll have to work just a little bit to get this pin out. And put my foot right back down so I can come up to the corner and pivot. Right at the edge. I'm going to hold that down so I catch it better. And then just pull my pins out as I get to them. And I do find that this way I can be a lot more consistent in getting a decent stitch the same distance from the edge of my binding, and it leaves me with a pretty nice result. So I'm just going to go through this corner again and show you. Just taking my time, getting up to the corner, pivoting, pull out my pin, I'm getting a little bit too much help. Okay. And inevitably, this is what happens though. I still didn't quite catch this corner, so I'll have to go back and do that. Which is why a lot of people prefer to hand stitch. You get a perfect result every time with hand stitching, but if you don't want to hand stitch, this would be an alternative. Just have to really be careful to catch it. That is a few different ways to put binding on the edge of your quilt and get it finished up. I hope you've learned something. If you've got any questions, let me know. And thanks for joining me. Have a great day.